Hello everyone! I saw something on Twitter that I just felt I had to make time to comment on, and that is this particular image that Short Fat Otaku, or Dev, decided to tweet out earlier this week. And, I do have quite a few criticisms of it, but we will go through the tweets first. But before that, I do want to make a bit of a disclaimer. I have been following Short Fat Otaku for a long time. I watch most of his videos, I watch every Dumping with Scrump, and generally I can tell that Short Fat Otaku does try and put in the work and put in the thought behind his videos to come to his conclusions. I think a problem with this particular compass, though, as with many people on YouTube, is that they haven't done the reading into the economics, reading such things as Thomas Sowell, going even further to read some Mises and Friedman, and maybe even going as far as to read some Rothbard and Hoppe. Though I myself have only made it as far as Friedman, I listen to enough Academic Agent and my good friend Economic Erudite to understand further theories beyond Friedman. Hence, I'm essentially a minarchist. Which, of course, puts me firmly in the bottom right corner, or the lib-right. Which, obviously, as we can see from Dev's compass, would mean that I go right up to the authoritarian right. But we will get into the issues with the compass and all this later. For now, we shall get into what Dev said on Twitter. So, quoting a tweet of Lilith Levette's being pro-libertarian, Dev had this to say with the accompanying picture. After thinking about it a bit, I think this is how we can accurately describe the effect Lilith's talking about here. The more libertarian you become, by necessity, the more centrist you become, because both the far left and far right require oppression of the individual. I mean, as I said before, I really like Dev, but this is absolutely a result of trying to be the enlightened centrist. At least he didn't make it a V shape, I suppose, which would essentially make the political compass a 2D line that some people have tried to do. But no, I do not agree that the political compass is a triangle. And let's go into a bit more detail on what it says on Dev's actual picture of the compass. So this is the real political compass. Libertarianism is mutually exclusive with any ideology that requires excessive force to implement. Not true. Libertarian socialists and libertarian capitalists are both unwilling to admit that their ideology will by necessity require extreme oppression from either the state or corporations. Again, not true. And in practice, they are fundamentally authoritarian. Most of the time, these people are too dumb to understand the natural end result of their own ideas. I mean, I know this might be ironic coming from my channel, given the amount I call Ash Sarkar and Owen Jones idiots, but when I am actually trying to debate serious subjects like this, I do try and refrain from calling people stupid. Especially when it's Dev, because I can tell Dev, as I said before, is intelligent and does put thought into his videos and commentary, usually. But as a view of someone on the lib-right, very much on the lib-right by the way, I even have to say that saying the lib-left is like that is a bit ridiculous. Though I will go into detail about what I think of the lib-left in a while. But another issue I have with this compass is that it assumes that, say if you're on the far right, you necessarily have to go up to the authoritarian right instead of the left to the centrist. And the same with the lib-lefts. They apparently can only go up instead of to the right. But I'm sure if pushed on this, Dev would say that indeed they can be pushed centre instead. And also, Dev, I am not surprised that you had to make this quote tweet. I woke up to a shit ton of people mad about this tweet, but they're all leftists. I mean, that's not true. I complained about it as well. Almost no rightist is complaining about the authoritarian leaning within their philosophy. I'm right here, Dev. There is no such thing as libertarian socialism. Stay mad about it. Again, kind of true, but at the same time, not, but again, I'll go into detail later. So before I go into detail about why saying that lib-writers will necessarily go authoritarian, I do want to point out some issues with the political compass as a means of visualising the political spectrum. So for starters, the political compass test website even point out the problem with the left-right paradigm. The introduction, we explain the inadequacies of the traditional left-right line. If we recognise that this is essentially an economic line, it's fine as far as it goes. So left wing means more socialist, right wing means more capitalist, essentially. We can show, for example, Stalin, Mao Zedong and Pol Pot with their commitment to a totally controlled economy on the hard left. Socialists like Mahatma Gandhi and Robert Mugabe would occupy a less extreme leftist position. Maggie Thatcher would be well over to the right, but further still would be someone like the ultimate free marketeer General Pinochet, based. So there you go. The left-right is supposed to be purely economics. The website then also goes on to say that deals with economics, but the social dimension is also important in politics. That's the one that the mere left-right scale doesn't adequately address, so we've added one, ranging in positions from extreme authoritarian to extreme libertarian. And this is all fair enough. It's not a terrible way to try and visualise the political spectrum, but it's also not the best, and I think that is mainly down to the questions they ask. For example, I think one of them says, there's no such thing as a free market if monopolies exist or something like that. And, that gets your opinion on whether monopolies should exist in a free market, but I can hardly say whether that's a more left-wing or right-wing position, or whether it's more authoritarian or libertarian position. As if you think monopolies should be broken up, you naturally will be more authoritarian. But it is also anti-free market, which means that you also move to the left. But how exactly that actually affects your results isn't entirely clear. And of course there are many other questions like that in the political compass test. And that's why you can end up with odd looking compasses such as this crowd chart of different nations. You've got ISIS apparently as more authoritarian leftists than the USSR, which I know. You've got Nazis in the top left as well, which generally they were more centrist. They privatised quite a lot of things. However, it did have to be either Nazi Party members or people who were loyal to the Nazi Party. So generally, although it was economically right-wing, really, it was incredibly authoritarian as well. So they should be more centre. You've got Saudi Arabia in the authoritarian right. Yeah, that's about right for the authoritarian, but are they they're probably more left-wing than Nazis? And then you have India, for some reason, in the lib-left quadrant, which doesn't make any sense to me because they have a caste system, which is pretty authoritarian in my opinion. And then you've got two results for China, one with a plus and a minus. I have no idea what the difference here is, but apparently one's in the right, more central area, and the other's very far left and fairly authoritarian, which honestly I'd have them a bit higher than that. And this isn't even, I think, the worst example of a crowd chart that is just terrible, because the website also has this picture of people as a crowd chart on the political compass, and apparently Pinochet, who killed maybe about 800 communists, is more authoritarian than Stalin, who killed way more, and even more authoritarian than Mao, who killed in the tens of millions of people. And I mean, if that example isn't bad enough, apparently Trump is more authoritarian than Mao, though he is more right-wing, obviously. Again, no. Reagan is apparently even more so authoritarian than Mao. Again, I can't see that happening. Saudi Arabia, maybe. But yeah, this is the problem with the way you answer questions in the test, I think. But according to this chart and Dev's real political compass, you have to be thinking on the same lines as a French socialist, Proudhon, who is one of those socialists that proudly declares that property is theft. And obviously the more right-wing you go, the more you think that property is the only way to deal with means of production and things like that. Which happens to be my opinion on it, so I'm a lot closer to Rothbard and Rand on the right than Proudhon, who is apparently a centrist, but if you're wanting to abolish property, I cannot at all say that you are a centrist. But hey, apparently, Dev, that is the philosopher who is the one true libertarian. So that goes through the main issues I have with the political compass. It's mainly to do with the actual test questions and how you end up resulting on the political spectrum, whereas I would make quite a few changes, as we can see from the results. However, now we need to get into the meat and potatoes of this video, which is my main problem with Dev's assertion that if you go far left or far right, you necessarily have to become more authoritarian. But of course, I'm only really going to talk about the lib-right. So I suppose we should use Rothbard as an example. So on Dev's political compass, you would see Rothbard here, right in the corner of the lib-right quadrant. And according to Dev, he thinks that Rothbard should be way up here, right in the authoritarian right section, right next to Pinochet, right on line with Stalin and Hitler and every other authoritarian dictator you can think of. And obviously this is ridiculous, as I'm going to read out a few quotes from Rothbard that means that he is anything other than authoritarian. Taxation is theft. Purely and simply, even though it is theft on a grand and colossal scale which no acknowledged criminals could hope to match. It is a compulsory seizure of property of the state's inhabitants or subjects. Libertarians hold the view that the only proper role of violence is to defend person and property against violence, that any use of violence that goes beyond such just defence is itself aggressive, unjust, and criminal. It is curious that people tend to regard government as quasi-divine, selfless Santa Claus organisation. Government was constructed neither for ability nor the exercise of loving care. Government was built for the use of force and for necessary demagogic appeals for votes. If individuals do not know their own interests in many cases, they are free to turn to private experts for guidance. It is absurd to say that they will be served better by a coercive, demagogic apparatus. And that's just a select few, but quite clearly, Murray Rothbard is completely against any sort of state existing because he just finds it a coercive, intruding, and immoral force, and especially since it has a monopoly on violence. And I can completely understand where he's coming from. I mean, we have seen in recent times the government in the UK with, say, the Equalities Act, using completely unjust force to force businesses to do as the state says. We have such things as hate speech laws in the UK, in which Scotland is currently progressing further and further into an authoritarian nightmare. And Tailed Feature, if you're watching this, yes, I still think eject Scotland is a sensible thing to do. And based off what Dev said in his political compass image, i.e. that people on the right are too stupid apparently to understand that being a libertarian capitalist, you have to admit that your ideas by necessity require extreme oppression from the state or corporations. And I'm here to tell you that, unfortunately, mega corporations only generally exist because of state power. A good friend of the channel, The Academic Agent, has an incredible video on why he is against antitrust laws, and I generally agree with the video. To put it a long story short, essentially, monopolies cannot exist without the state. There has been no example that I have found of a monopoly existing without some sort of coercive force from the state, or if you want to go way back in time, with coercive force used by robber barons. Some examples of this are antitrust laws, as Thomas Sowell goes through in his book Basic Economics, which I suggest everyone reads, including you, Dev. In Chapter 8 of Basic Economics, Thomas Sowell goes through regulation and antitrust laws that governments put in place. For example, the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887 was to stop railways from having predatory prices, as there were cartels going on, but all it ended up doing was actually making train travel which less people were doing because trucks started going on the road, and enforced the monopolies of the companies that were affected under this commission, because other railway companies could not enter the market due to these antitrust laws being so punitive and forcing them to have the same prices as the monopolies, when maybe they needed to put their prices up to make a profit, etc., etc. He also goes into many other examples, such as AT&T now being one of the main telecom companies in the US, and again that is mainly because of government backing with antitrust laws that just entrench these monopolies in place. In a free market, this would not happen. And how do I know this? I know this because there is no example of a monopoly forming in a free market without government backing. Or at least if they do exist, they don't last very long, because huge corporations would not last long, as they become these super organisms, as Jonathan Haidt puts it. They are very, very rigid to change, and with the way the world is, constant change is needed in the market. It is also unpredictable what innovations will be made in the near future, and it also allows businesses that are not good for the current market to fail, and ones that are good to succeed. Why this would necessarily result in any sort of oppression is beyond me. As long as property rights are protected, whether it be in Ancapistan through the mutual agreement to the NAP, or whether you have a minarchist state that does have basic police and judicial systems to enforce these property rights, which is generally where I am on the political spectrum, then I don't see why that would be the case, because as I said, you would not have these corporations without government backing. And there are countless other examples of this, and I do just put this mistake that Dev has made down to his lack of knowledge in economics. And that is actually where I put most problems of the modern day down to. We are all living in Keynesian countries because we do not particularly understand what economics is about and what the best economic policies are. We just think more GDP equals good, which Austrian economists do not think is necessarily the case, which happens to be my position as well. But that's just a quick overview of why being lib-right is actually a perfectly valid position and does not necessitate moving up to the authoritarian right. I've gone through examples of why Rothbard would be majorly insulted by being called an authoritarian. And I'm also going to be a bit of an apologist to the lib-left. I do think the lib-left does have a bit of a problem in that if you push someone who is very lib-left, they will end up being authoritarian. Hell, I even think your radical centrist libertarian Proudhon would absolutely turn more authoritarian, because he seems to think that property is theft and that it needs to be abolished. To anyone on the lib right who does believe in property rights, such as myself, that just seems like you should be in the authoritarian section of that political compass. He's all for free association and things like that, but ultimately, if there's no property to associate with, owned by someone, where the hell is the freedom and the libertarianism in that? But also, if you are ever in a conversation with a lib-leftist who seem to think that minimum wage is the best idea in the world, and then you push them and push them and push them, they do end up saying that you do end up needing more government, or more influence of government, I should say, which naturally means it's more authoritarian. A quick example off the top of my head is that when I'm in an argument about minimum wage, I usually say that minimum wage means there are actually less jobs available, because it prices out low-paying jobs that quite a lot of young people in the market need to gain the skills that will get them on further in life to better jobs. Hence, I had an unpaid internship for a year. So when they say that, they say, well, why can't someone else just provide the skills? And then I obviously have to keep saying, well, someone has to be paid for that somewhere, otherwise it's just pure charity. And unfortunately, not everyone can afford to give out pure charity to give skills like that. So naturally, they start saying it should be provided by the government. Oh, that means more taxes. Oh, that means a bigger government. Oh, it just speed rolls into being either more authoritarian, or they have actually backpedaled their positions like that before. I mean, I certainly have. I used to be lib-left, and I've moved right to the right. So when I say that there's no such thing as lib-left, I am kind of memeing. I do think there is such a thing. However, I think it ends up meaning that you have a commune like we saw in the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, which quickly turned into an authoritarian hellhole with a hell of a load of murders, or you end up with the Paris Commune in France in the Revolutionary era, where it ended up lasting about 3 months. And obviously, if you don't want that and you point out these problems, they do end up moving right or more authoritarian. Whereas I have these examples, I can't see Dev actually bringing examples to me of lib-righties then saying, oh, you're right, maybe we do need to be more authoritarian, or moving leftward, but he didn't put in his example that they can move leftward. But don't get me wrong, Dev, I still like you, and I know I'm 17 minutes in, but I am happy to have a stream with you and discuss these points. But I think this brings me nicely onto what I think the quote-unquote real political compass is, though I won't call it that. This is just personally what I think is a better compass than what is provided by the Political Compass Test website. So on screen now is generally what I see as a good political compass, the best one I've seen anyway. And this was created by my good friend Economic Erudite, and he had this compass at the start of a thread describing it, which I will summarise for you neatly. In short, he sees capitalism and socialism as a good replacement for the left-right spectrum, since the left-right is constantly conflated with things that aren't specifically to do with economics. So just to describe that quickly, the more on the right you are, the more for a free market you are, the more on the left you are, the more for centralised and organisation of the economy you are for. Hence we see Marxism on the far left, and we see anarcho-capitalism on the far right. And the vertical axis is again authoritarian versus libertarian in the same way as it is on the political compass. An economic erudite describes this as the more authoritarian you are, the more you want the state monopoly of violence to have an influence on society, whether it be for social policies or economic policies and things like that. Hence, at the top you have Nazism, fascism and Marxism right at the top, with Pinochetism seen on the right-hand side, environmentalism also seen slightly below Marxism on the left-hand side. And he's also put some examples for us to get an idea of where everything is, and it's generally the same as we saw on the Political Compass website. For instance, we have Pinochet in the top right, we have anarcho-capitalism or Rothbard in the bottom right, though on the left-hand side he seems to have put every single person who is a Marxist right in the top right, which I have to say I agree with. Though the lib-left is an odd area, he's got wet Tories, kind of centrist, but slightly to the libertarian left, which generally I can understand, because Prosecco Tories do tend to be against capitalism when it suits them, and they do tend to want to be quite libertarian when it comes to social issues, which is fine. But then he's got corporatism, as pretty much the only thing that is hard on the lib-left, and I can understand why, because corporations as we see them today, and corporatism is probably the closest thing we're living to in the modern world today. It definitely is leaning towards socialism, mainly because it is generally centralised in terms of the economy, and that's why we have massive government spending and huge antitrust policies and things like that that keep these corporations held up. Hence why when you're ever in a conversation with someone on the lib-right, they are constantly criticising government and corporations, but they see the government as the main enemy of it, because that's the only reason corporations exist, or are allowed to exist on a long-term scale. Though one criticism I do have of this is, as I said before, I do think there is such thing as a lib-left. It just means that you can't go above Dunbar's number of about 240 people living in the commune to try and be self-sufficient. You will essentially have a hunter-gatherer society. Though, of course, as I said before, in the modern world that is basically impossible, and when you push the lib-leftists, they absolutely either go more authoritarian or concede the point and go to the right as I used to. But if you're interested in a further description of this political compass, do see the link to Twitter in the description. But I hope I have made it very clear, Dev, I do not think that your real political compass is at all useful. Of course, as I have said many times, you are an intelligent person, you do usually do the background reading on these things. I just think in this case you really don't understand the lib-right position and the economics and the praxeology behind the thought of your average lib-right person. So if you ever want to have a chat about it, Dev, I am fine to do it on a stream, or even if you want to do it off the record, I am totally fine with that. But I do have to say that making the political compass into a triangle like this, and then having as your ultimate libertarian Proudhorn who wants to abolish property, I don't think it's a good way to go. And to imply that everyone on the right, especially Murray Rothbard, if you think he's really going to end up right at the top end of the authoritarian spectrum, you really have to do more reading on that. And even as I pointed out, Proudhorn would absolutely be more authoritarian if you actually pushed him on his positions. But anyway, I think I've made my point loud and clear. So, Dev, if you watch this, thank you very much for watching, and I do hope we can have a conversation about this, because as much as I hate the political compass, I do think it is a good tool for visualising the political spectrum. And for the rest of you, that is all. So, as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.